Dungeons are a classic staple of old school games. But I'll be honest, something I've always struggled with is designing dungeons that make sense, that feel organic. I found a book that helps me with that. I really like reading books to help me with learning how to do things. I get more out of them than I feel I get out of a lot of videos, which is, strange because I'm making a video about it. I'm going to look at this book that has been helping me, and I'm going to give you some tips that I've learned from it that I'm implementing into a dungeon I'm building right now. And if this is all stuff that you know or you have other tips, let me know below and we'll start a conversation about it. I'm Tristan. This is Heroes and Homebrew. So there are tons of resources out there about dressing your dungeon and populating it, and you can use wandering monster tables for your dungeons and treasure tables from the whatever rule set you're using. And I've never had a problem drawing the dungeon. It's just filling it in afterwards and making it feel like it makes sense and it's not just random stuff all put together. I read a book and I did a video about it, the Campaign World Generator, and I found it really useful. I really liked the way the author wrote the book. It was by Kent David Kelly. I went out and looked at some of his other books and I picked them up because they were on sale on drive-through. So I picked up like a bunch of them and started reading it, and I've started implementing some of the things from it. So we're going to take a look at it. It's the Castle Old Skull Classic Dungeon Design Guide, Volume 1. I think there's 4 volumes. I picked up all 4. And then there's a book about traps. There's a book about monsters, a book about treasure. So all of these you can implement together, but today we're just going to look at the Dungeon Design Guide 1. This is the book, Castle Old Skull, the Classic Dungeon Design Guide 1 by Kent David Kelly. And I'm just going to briefly go through the chapters. I'm not going to read it all, obviously. It's over 200 pages. So it starts with your adventure scenarios, and it gives you like a range of if it's a basic adventure, intermediate, advanced, and it basically just gives you a concept. So for instance, if we look at the first one here, the Alliance in the Deep, the adventurers are asked to find a beleaguered allied faction in the dungeon, dwarves, gnomes, subterranean humans, etc., and to render an offer of allegiance on their benefactor's behalf. So it's just a vague concept that you're left to fill in on your own. And it's randomly generated, or you can choose one if you want. So now that you've got your adventure hook, your scenario, it has twists. So if we got the first one where they have to go help a friendly faction, you can roll up a twist. So like, how's the story going to change? And let's say Dante's Revenge, the dungeon opens into the netherworld, an alternate prime, a different time, or another plane of existence. The adventurers must deal with the new, much more hostile environment they discover. So that's kind of cool. They're going into this dungeon to help a faction, and then all of a sudden they discover something even deeper and more dangerous. And then you can roll for your benefactors. So you're filling all this out before you even start designing the dungeons. It gives you an idea of how to thematically create your dungeon. And it's got some descriptors that you can roll on for your NPC. So next, after you have your adventure scenario, you need to give them a base of operation. Now, if they've already got a town that they're working with, and this dungeon is going to be close to the town, that's not a big deal. However, you can roll on it if you're creating this whole new adventure from scratch and they're going to be sent somewhere else to deal with this. You can create a new base of operation, a safe place for the adventurers to go in between delves into the dungeon. A Roma caravan on the windswept moors, a private den reachable only from a waterfall cavern, and then some rumors. Guys, might as well throw in some rumors about this place too. Maybe they've hear these rumors in the tavern. And some of them are true, some of them are false, some of them are kind of true, but there's a little twist to them. So all of this is coming before you create the dungeon. That's why I really like this book, because it lets you sort of create the precursor to the dungeon delve, and all of this can kind of like inform your ideas about what's going to happen in the dungeon, what the dungeon looks like. I just hit my microphone. What themes are in the dungeon, what kind of different factions or creatures might be in the dungeon. And you go to the way to the dungeon, what kind of travel do they have to go through, how do you get into the dungeon, some wilderness counters along the way. So you could go A to Z from like introduction at the first level, like this is how the campaign's starting. Some encounters along the way. You're creating this entire adventure from scratch. Yes, it's not really emergent storytelling, but if you're running a sandbox, it's good to maybe have that first little push to be like, hey, here's a little quest to get you going, give you an idea of what's out there, because I've found that if you just plop the characters down and be like, what do you want to do? Then sometimes they freeze and they're not quite sure, well, where should we go? What should we do? Giving them that one little, like, hey, here's a quest, go do this, and then it's going to build off of that. Next is the principles of the dungeon, the background, who built it, how many different builders were there in the dungeon. If it's multiple levels, if it's a 10 level mega dungeon, then there's going to be multiple people who have built this dungeon. So you can roll on these tables and get a sort of a history of the dungeon out of these tables. So you can roll on the direction of dungeon construction. Was it built on the surface first? Was it built underground first? Did it go like deep up? Was it deep underground and then it kind of spread both ways? Who are the original builders and who continued building off of it? The dungeon surround, which is sort of what is encompassing, like where, if the dungeon is underground, there's usually something on top. It's not always just like a hole in the ground in the middle of a forest. Maybe there's an abandoned temple or an abbey, or there was a quarry that just opened up the entrance to this dungeon. There's maybe a insect hive, a giant insect hive, or it's in the basement of a mansion. And of course, you need your dungeon names because it's got to sound creepy and dangerous. And the dungeon names is a D1000 list, so it's a lot of different names. You can mix and match them, of course. Or if you got your own name for it already set up, then, or something in your head, then use that. It also has some examples of real world locations that could be an inspiration for your dungeon, like the catacombs of Paris, caves in Budapest, Meganut Line, Mammoth Cave, Mary King's Close in Edinburgh, things of that sort. Real world examples that you could go and look at pictures of and sort of get an idea for what you want your dungeon to be. This is actually, I found really interesting. So if you want your dungeon, obviously the dungeon is a fantasy adventure, it's in a fantasy world, but you can have some realistic elements to it. For instance, where is the air in the dungeon coming from? There has to be air in there if living creatures are surviving in there. Undead creatures don't need air, so it's a moot point, but there has to be some sort of air. Maybe there's shafts coming down from the surface that are giving air, or there's air coming up from beneath that are connected to caverns that have fresh air coming in. How is food surviving? How are the things in the dungeon surviving? Are they eating each other? Are they just feeding off adventurers that come in every couple hundred years? Is there a source of food that is helping keep these creatures, the monsters in the dungeon, alive? And if they're intelligent monsters, like, do they have do they have food coming in from the surface that is being brought to them to sustain them? So these are kind of like little things that maybe you don't think about too much in the dungeon, and you don't have to. It's not necessarily something that's going to come up, but having these ideas, be like, oh, well, there's orcs living on the third level of the dungeon. Obviously, they need to be eating something. So maybe there's a way in from the surface that the orcs are bringing in their own food to help them survive. Where's the fresh water coming from? Is there light in the dungeon? Yes, most creatures in old school games all have infravision, so they don't need the light. But adventurers need light, and if this is a enclosed area in the dungeon or underground and there's very little ventilation, then using those torches is going to create a lot of smoke and it's going to make it very hard to breathe down there. So until I read that, it was never something that I really considered. It was like, well, if you have a party of, say, let's say 4 people, and 2 of them are carrying torches, those torches are going to create a lot of smoke. And that smoke is going to make things, is going to be very thick in an enclosed area with no ventilation. So how are they going to breathe? A lantern won't create as much smoke, but if they're carrying torches, then this is something that's going to be a huge problem for them. It's also going to obscure visibility. It has examples of real world caves, castles, manor houses. So these are all caves, castles, manors, um, catacombs, tombs, are all different ways of flavoring your dungeon. And we'll see it later on. It's a way of sort of randomly rolling up what each room in your dungeon is going to be like or what it's used for. Now it goes into drawing your dungeon, using images for inspiration, geomorphs, the depth of the dungeon. You can roll on how many levels it is, or you can just decide. I like the idea of not knowing how many levels it is. The dungeon I've started building is right now I'm on level 1. It's 52 rooms on level 1. For sure, there's going to be a level 2 and a level 3. But after that, I don't know. Maybe it's just going to keep building if I ever actually play in this dungeon, and I'd like to run a few games in it and see how it works. But as it gets played in, that dungeon is probably going to get deeper and deeper, and it'll probably go wider and wider, and it's going to change as areas get cleared. I have some factions for the first level. I've got dwarven miners, I've got lizard men, I've got orcs, and they're all kind of doing different things on this one level in different sections of the level, and how adventurers interact with those is going to change how that dungeon actually becomes formed in the future on future campaigns into it. All right, here we go. This is the interesting part that really made me go, oh, I can do that, and I can sort of see how things are going to build out. So designing dungeon levels, you have your dungeon level themes. It gives you an example of a thematic dungeon. So you can roll on this table for your themes if you don't have one in mind for the first level. The first level of mine is a mix of a dungeon, like a real world dungeon, like prison and temple, with also a small area of mines where the dwarves have started to mine out. So the 9 sector system, this is what I really like. So I created basically this in Excel. There's 9 boxes. But what it allows you to do is sort of in each sector write what's going to be like the main aspect of that sector. So if we look here, we have the northwest sector is mines, gnomes, and burrows. And then the north sector is more mines, goblins, besieged gnomes. So these 2 sectors are kind of interacting. They'll flow into each other as the adventurers go through to be like, oh, well, the gnomes were here. Here they're kind of like warring against the goblins. And then further on to the northeast, you have goblin lairs and goblin traps, and then stairs going up to the surface. And you can see how, as you fill in these boxes, how you can make each sector sort of interacting, and there's going to be sort of a natural flow to your dungeon as you're creating it and as the adventurers explore it. So this is what really helped me this was a problem I've always had with dungeons when I create dungeons. Is I never feel like my dungeons sort of have any natural flow to them. And I always feel like any dungeon I create is it's a series of rooms that are sort of random and don't make sense. So the idea of doing this really helped me when I sat down and I took the information that I rolled ahead of time and I started to write down these 9 sectors of the dungeon. It really made me think of, like, when I was drawing it, how these sections are going to interact. So I think in mind, I had like the northeast sector was going to be completely cut off from the rest of the dungeon. It's accessible if they find secret doors, or they manage to cross a gap in the corridor where like the floor is caved in. And the reason I did that is because that section is going to be far more dangerous than the rest of that level. That section is, it's almost like it's been purposely cut off by other denizens of the dungeon. So that sector is full of undead, but there is more treasure in there. So higher risk, higher reward. If the adventurers decide we're not going there, because they'll probably hear rumors about it, and there is sort of clues to it about it in the connecting sectors, they might decide it's too dangerous, we're not going there. We'll just explore the rest of the dungeon. And then maybe they'll come back when they're level 2, level 3, level 4, and be like, okay, now we can take it on. But that sector is far more dangerous. But knowing that, when I drew my dungeon, I purposely put in those secret doors in that area, and I cut off the corridor. And also in the dungeon I drew, I had orcs coming up from the second level fighting against the dwarven miners that are occupying the northwest, north, and west sector. So the dwarf miners are kind of occupying this area, and orcs are coming up from down below, and the orcs are also spreading east, and they're fighting against the lizard men. And the lizard men also are kind of guarding against this blocked off sector where undead occasionally seep through and are sort of attacking the lizard men. So all of this interaction is going on in the dungeon at the time where the adventurers come in. Now, another interesting thing that the book talks about afterwards is having zones of varying danger. So you have your green zones, which are safe, and adventurers can go back there and rest and, re-equip or resupply. And so I decided, well, this northwest sector, there's going to be an entrance from the surface here, and this is going to be the dwarven base camp, so it's going to be safe for players, and it's going to be kind of like a mini dwarven encampment, so the players can actually resupply there. They can buy like equipment there if they need to, and they can rest there without having to go all the way back to town. However, if they don't bring the gold back to town, they don't get the XP. There's a small difference, but it's a safe zone. And then I have sectors that are yellow. They're not completely safe, but they're not entirely deadly either. They can survive there, but I wouldn't rest there. I wouldn't spend like a day or two there just hanging out like I would in a green zone. And then the red zones are incredibly dangerous, and that's where it's going to be the most deadly. And it kind of flows like the adventurers, as they explore, will kind of see that things are getting more dangerous depending on where they go. But I don't have necessarily like 2 yellow zones in a row or 2 red zones in a row. It'll go like green, yellow, red. And then if they go left, they'll go into another yellow zone. Or if they go right, they'll go into another green zone. And it alternates. And it goes into your major monster populations, what you might find in each area depending on the theme, and then your atmosphere, the different dungeon conditions for light sources and air clarity, air currents, which maybe might be a bit more than you might want, but I think I'll probably end up using some of this. At least I'll use it per sector. Like each sector might have different air quality and stuff like that, plant life, animal life, odors, things like this, and eventually it'll go into your rooms. It doesn't go super in depth, but depending on the type of dungeon or the type of theme, so like if it's cavern or it's a dungeon or it's a temple or it's a manor, it has different rooms that might be connected to that. Because my dungeon has sort of a temple tomb dungeon theme, they kind of work into each other. So you have the dungeon, then you have the tomb, then you have a temple. I've rolled on, or have been rolling on all 3 of these tables. I haven't finished doing it yet. Sub themes for dungeon levels. So maybe you have your main theme, and then there's another underlying theme to it. So overall, this book has a lot of good strategies and information. The main thing I wanted to show you was the 9-sector system. If 9 sectors is too much for you, then you could definitely narrow it down. Maybe that level only has 4 sectors. It depends on the size of your dungeon, of course. So if you only have, if you only want it to have 4 sectors, or it's a smaller dungeon, maybe 4 is all you need. Maybe 2 is all you need. But having those sectors and being able to like draw it out and plot how they work together really gives it more of a sense of like there's something going on in the dungeon. It's not just random rooms. Here's some dressings and furnishings, features of curiosity. So it's got some little things in there, and then of course you can add your traps and what have you. There's a book on dungeon traps. I'll leave links for all of the books down below. More curiosity, doors, apertures. Personally, I mean, I might roll on the doors for each door. I've got a lot of doors on my first level. I think most of them will just be common stuck wooden doors, but some of them definitely I'm going to like make them a little different. Corridors and room connectors. It has some information, some advice for DMs running their dungeon. Talks about how if your players are new, then having just tons of death traps is probably not a great idea because it's not going to be fun for anyone. They're just going to keep dying. And how to avoid making a TPK meaningless, or if they're learning how the dungeon works, because they're not going to know, the players are not going to know when they go in what kind of danger level this dungeon is overall. It's got advice for that as well, which I found really, really interesting. Talks about going too deep. Like if the players go to level 3, like dungeon level 3, and they're only level 1, dungeon level 3 is going to be way too deadly for them. So how do you avoid that? What can they learn about it before they all get killed? Projecting the danger level. There's got different types of TPKs. Like sometimes TPKs are caused by the players, sometimes caused by the game master, and sometimes they're just caused by the dice. And what to do after a TPK. So there's a lot of information in this book. It's huge. It's a lot to go over in one video, and this is already going really long. So I think the main thing for myself to take out of this, the advice from this book and the concepts from this book, are the sector system, creating sectors for my dungeon, and sort of how they interact thematically. If there's multiple factions in there, how the factions are interacting together, and making it seem organic, like the flow of the dungeon seem organic. Another concept which is strange because in the book it shows it in the example dungeon, but doesn't really talk about it in the actual body of the book, is the wire map of the dungeon. So it's called a wire map because basically you just have a block, so like this is a room, and then a line going somewhere else. Like this is another room, and you're not drawing the dungeon per se. You're just kind of like plotting it. You can base your rooms on that and the themes and stuff like that. So those are the concepts that I'm taking from it. Maybe if you struggle with dungeons like I do, hopefully maybe some of these ideas will help you. I'll put a link down below so you can go pick it up. It's available on Amazon as well. It's available on DriveThruRPG and PDF. And there's lots of books in the series. I think they're really interesting. I find that they help me. And they're just fun to read because I like reading books about this stuff, and it gives me ideas and concepts to think about. So that's it for now. Till next time, save a seat for me at your table.